we're going to talk about democracy, the thing that I think we all are slightly struggling with in the world that we see around us. What is democracy and how is it changing? And I want to talk about why I think it's actually foundational, but in a way that we don't often think about. I'm not going to talk about ourselves, you can see all that stuff. The democracy I'm interested in is this one. I'm interested in democracy as democratizing the power to create society. Not democracy just as the vote, not this democracy that's reduced to the notion of how you tick a box, but democracy is a foundational idea of distributing and decentralizing the power to create society. Now, why that's important is that when you go back through history, actually we've understood democracy as a vote, but actually when you go back through history, democracy is not just the vote. It's actually, if you look at the UK, 1066, when effectively they understood title deeds and ownership and the decentralization of ownership rights and recognizing ownership rights was the first step. Second step was perhaps actually building banks for the poor. Third step was perhaps building schools for the poor. Fourth step was effectively perhaps going into housing and social housing. Fifth step was perhaps looking at actually the democratization and the access of the vote. So the vote is actually a cherry on the cake of a much larger institution. And the challenge I want to put to you is whilst we've kept precious about the vote, the underlying infrastructure of democracy has been challenged. And that is, I think, the real project of the 21st century, and also, I think, the real opportunity of the 21st century. Why it's important is this. It sits in context of this, of massive concentrations of global wealth in the hands of the few, at the same time, which is actually accelerating globally, and we're seeing similar models to what we saw in the early 19th century, early 20th century. The second one is this, the Branko-Milanovic curve. It's called the elephant curve, which shows that actually the proceeds of globalization for the last 20 years, the middle classes in the Western democracies have actually had very little return on globalization. What you've seen is stagnating wages, and in a way, what you've seen is effectively the 1% or the few capture much of the gains, and the rest of the gains being actually much more global. And in a way, you can argue that we're living in a consequence of this reality. And this reality is like a glass wall here. It's not just a cliff, it's a glass wall, which developing economies around the world are now starting to face. So the question, and the thing I want to put down to you, is that I think we're in a revolution, but the revolution is actually the destruction of the middle class. And also, not just the middle class, the destruction of managerialism, which the middle class was built out of. What we're seeing is automation, AI, and the whole precursor of this story start to effectively erode the value of this economy. And I think the crisis we're in the middle of is much more structural than we sort of think about. It's actually a long-term reframing of our economy, very similar to what we saw in the Industrial Revolution. Yet most of our responses seem to be patches. Let's have more startups. Let's have a slightly faster government. But actually, these aren't the issues. What we have to talk about is much more structural work. Here's some reflections. I think one of the big challenges of democracy is how do we deal with democracy in a complex world. So China feels sometimes somehow easier to deal with the complexity of the world when actually, how do we deal with this? So this is effectively a system map or a kind of a causality loop map of obesity. All those drivers, all those little dots that you see are drivers and factors which drive obesity. Just obesity, right? I'm not talking about poverty, I'm not talking just obesity. And what you see here is there's no single one magic bullet. There's no single one cause, there's no single one actor, there's no single one agent. And the question is, behind it are multiple actors, multiple policies, multiple agents. The question in a democracy is that we have to deal with complex problems which have complex multiple actors. So if you want to drive change, there is no single strategy any single authority can write. There's no one single management consultant which can write the obesity strategy because it involves 50 to 100 different organizations. How do you drive change in this world is one of the fundamental challenges of democracy. Right? If we want to preserve a democratic system, we have to somehow incentivize innovation throughout all of this field without necessarily imagining a single startup, a single hero bullet, or a single strategy written by a single organization will ever be able to achieve it. Oops. And also when you look at these problems, through a system lens, what you also figure out is maybe we're even solving the wrong problems. So, this is a piece of work that we're doing in Dubai, and people were saying, hey, could you deal with the food waste problem that we've got? And everyone said, let's look at the restaurant recycling of food. We were like, yeah, we could look at the restaurant recycling, but if you look at the genuine aspect of food waste, well, the reality is you just need to go vegan. And I'm serious. If you look at the issue of carbon production from dairy and meat, that's your big food waste in the system. So when you look at a system level crisis, your solutions become radically different. And already, otherwise you can look at problems which look like real. You can see the waste there, but actually the system level effects of the dairy and the meat that we eat is substantial, seriously substantial, much more so than even our logistics and our buildings produce. So when you look at system level problems, you come to different types of solutions. Now those solutions, say if you wanted to support Stockholm going vegan, what would you do? How would you respond to Stockholm going vegan? This was your design challenge. Well, you'd use a multiplicity of interventions, right? You wouldn't use a single magic bullet. You'd support new food-based startups. You'd support new forms of restaurants. You'd support new forms of actually pricing those liabilities and those costs. You'd use a system of interventions to effectively drive change. And we've done this sort of stuff before. Those sort of problems require a different mentality and a different way of dealing with stuff. And the other thing we learned was too often, in terms of designing change, people tend to focus on change being either the physical product or they can focus on a policy. But actually what you find is designing change requires you to operate diagonally from the physical object all the way down to effectively policy and regulation. The boring stuff we don't like to talk about. Now, the fundamental here is, if we want to preserve a democratic infrastructure, it is not about a single person or a single organization writing that story. It is about decentralizing and distributing the capability for multiple actors to innovate together. Now, that is the challenge for a democratic institution. It's much easier in an authoritarian system to be able to say, right, I want this future, everyone else follow. But as soon as you do that, you destroy the intelligence of a system. And that is not the only issue. So, if we want to unleash the creative capacity in a complex world, we have to release the capacity of innovators on the ground. It is not the managers that can drive insight. It is the innovation on the ground and the leaders. And too often, we think about management-driven innovation as opposed to emergent innovation. So how do we drive change across that system? All the way from an employment contract, right? So you want to innovate in the 21st century? We've been doing this work in the UK. Well, actually, our employment contracts do not take account of emotional labor. They don't even understand it, right? So if you look at how work has changed, the emotional labor of work has massively gone up, which means that when you come home, you're emotionally exhausted. Your ability to give attention to your loved ones, your children, is seriously diminished, which has impact on people's family lives. How do we imagine a world of emotional labor, and how do we imagine a world of emotional contracts in that world? I think it's fundamentally important. How do you imagine change in any form of system when there's multiple actors? So too often in design, we focus on single actor models. How do you imagine when they've got 40 different innovators? This, I think, is a fundamental question. Now, why I think that's important is that I think when people talk about the fourth industrial revolution, what they're also talking about is a different way of innovating. So if you look at this diagram, what you'll see is the fourth industrial revolution decentralizes production, looks remarkably similar to this, which is actually the world of William Morris and Craft. So in a craft revolution, you had decentralized models of production. In the fourth industrial revolution, you also have the capacity to decentralize the mode of production. Now, in that reality, you can decentralize production, but you also have to decentralize innovation and creativity. How do you create a society for that? How do you create a society which is supporting unleashing the full capacity of everyone? Why is that important? Right now, we're living in a world, right, where there's a bank, a European bank, which is looking to go down from 50,000 people to 800. 50,000 people to 800 over the next 8 years. You've got Bertzoger, which is an amazing Dutch care company, which has 10,000 nurses. 10,000 nurses. How many people do you think it has in administrative HQ? Some guesses. 10,000 nurses. How many people in headquarters? 20. Any others? 200. 20 person wins. They have 50 people. 50 people in HQ. So what we're seeing is the death of managerialism. And in that future, we have to drive innovation on the front end. Here the nurses are innovating, not the managers. So what happens in this future means that you have to drive innovation to the front end. What does that do? And that's again, this is the real power of democracy if we can democratize creativity. If we try to centralize creativity and advance managerialism, actually it only advances an authoritarian view of the world. If we want to unleash democracy, we have to democratize creativity, and that is our leverage over any other. And all the infrastructure of this stuff is on the table, right? All of this stuff. So we've been doing stuff like this. Colleague of mine, Alex DeParvin, has been leading on this, open source housing, which you can 3D route and print around the world. And literally there's like 32 chapters, I'm going to flick through this, to open source furniture company, which you can print anywhere around the world. You can deliver it literally 7 miles from any city around the world. When we first launched it, in 2011, we had literally people around the world downloading it, iterating it, and sharing it back, and going, this is how you can do it. And this stuff is all happening right now. So this sort of innovation capacity of our real world is matched by a re-understanding of actually what democracy means in the 21st century. But underneath this all is, I think, the real challenge. So too often we put our focus on innovation in startups. Too often we put our focus, but actually the real challenge is this, the boring revolution. The stuff that sits underneath it. The stuff that we don't want to talk about. Because if you look back at the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just the technology we invented. We invented a new institutional infrastructure. We invented stuff like Encyclopedia Britannica, the Standards Institute, British Standards Institute. These things were fundamental to unlocking the Industrial Revolution. Now, what is the new Industrial Revolution institutional infrastructure is what we have to reinvent. I'll give you an example. Currently, the state doesn't account for future liabilities. So future social costs are not really understood by the state. What do I mean by that? In America, it costs $144,000 to put someone in prison a year. In the UK, a young offenders prison, it costs £238,000 a year for a young person to be locked up and secured. Now, in that context, it costs $75,000 to put someone in, I think it's Yale, at pure tuition fees. It costs about £75,000 to put them into Eton. Right? Now, why do I say that? When you start to understand these social costs from a long-term perspective, so when the state starts to understand future costs and liabilities, you can start to innovate in ways that we have not yet seen. So this is a piece of work that was done in Chicago called $1 Million Blocks, looking at urban blocks that were costing, in reoffending terms, $1 million for the state. Now imagine the state saying, this is our long-term cost of obesity, this is our long-term cost of health, of any of the preventive issues, whether reoffending rates, any of these issues, and able to capitally investigate it. We do preventive investment, but it's relatively minor compared to the real issues that we understand. And largely, that's to do with accounting. So if many of you will know, because the state never says this is our 10-year cost for reoffending, you would change reoffending because you'd capitally invest against it. And that sort of innovation is really on the table. Stuff like social impact bonds are really poems of this future. So changing stuff like accounting rules allows us to reimagine how we do preventative economies. You want to build a preventive health economy? Change the accounting rules. They are fundamental to this story. And you can build whole new different types of business models, new ways of dealing with this stuff. Now, also in this story is regulation and how we imagine regulation. Regulation is about to be, everyone talks about smart contracts, you've probably heard it a lot. How many of you heard about smart policy? Why not? Right? It's exactly the issue. So parametric policy, policy which is conditional, that stuff is almost real. You're starting to see experiments in New Zealand where people are trying to look at codified policy. Now the question is, when we start to look at smart policy or codified policy, what is a green paper? What is a white paper? How do you ensure legibility? How do you ensure legitimacy? These are the questions that we have to start experimenting with. Why smart policy is interesting, it allows for massive parametric variation across a society. So the policy that might be appropriate in Stockholm may be actually quite different in Vesco. And that allows you to be able to carry that reality. So we need to start to think about how we regulate and for this world, for this economy in a radically different way, which we haven't started to do. And I wanted to just say, I mean, what is smart policy? What are smart receipts? Why are smart receipts important? Because currently, we've been doing some of this work, so if you want to recycle an Apple product, right? If you could provide an aggregate warranties, the warranties of all the components being stacked and able to be recompiled, you can start to build a circular economy of continuously hacking products without destroying the warranty infrastructure of the whole. So these boring things called receipts, and if you can digitize them, fundamentally allow you to build circular hackable economies. Now that is something that is now possible in a way that we've never seen it before. All the way through to smart rent. Imagine your rental agreements for offices was not linked just to location, but to link to the performative impact of the organization. Again, that is possible. Or a restaurant whose rent was linked to the footfall of the street. Again, that is possible. So suddenly it doesn't become a static instrument, but fundamentally starts to change these things. These things are coming, and what they're all doing is building a new class of linked models. Models which link public value and private value in a way we've not seen before. And it's really important that this world isn't built by the few tech companies, but is genuinely led in the public interest by the public in a way that we've not seen. And I think there's lots of stuff in this around programmable standards, real-time user feedback. How are we going to do any of this stuff is actually open to discussion, and we can carry on the debate afterwards. All the way through to land rights. Land rights can be unbundled. Property rights are about to be unbundled. Use rights, development rights, these are all about to be changed. Property models that we've currently got, which is the foundation of a lot of our democratic infrastructure, is actually able to be unpicked and democratized in ways that we've never done before, with differential taxation across any of this stuff. So speculation can be priced in a way we've never seen before. Now, why I say this stuff, it's important for the public to be in this conversation and to be writing the rules of this tomorrow, not just recipients of techno-visions, but actually large corporates who are giving over platforms, right? And all this stuff is really more and more possible than we've ever seen. There's some work we've been doing around programmable property rights, which opens up these sort of conversations. But also, more fundamentally, it opens up a new value chain. So we've been looking at how do you fund the High Line in London. Now, High Line in New York, when it was funded, created massive amounts of private uplift in land value to all the offices and blocks adjacent to it. So this public infrastructure created massive amounts of private value, and the private value wasn't really captured. Now imagine a world where we know we can link the private uplifted value back to the public common goods. Well, you can. There are things called covenants, which basically say the uplift value could be shared back with the trust that invested in the High Line. We can do that on land registry. Historically, we've done that with churches. So churches, when they needed repairing, could call on houses nearby to invest in the repair of those churches. Now we can automate those little algorithms and effectively bury them in a way we've not seen before. So what this can create is a new class of business models which are focused on the commons. So in the UK, a state school owned by the state, if it's outstanding, puts £100,000 on the price of a local house, private house. So this relationship between common goods and private goods can be fundamentally rebalanced in a way we've not seen before. And these sort of linked business models, or what I would call system business models, are becoming viable because technology is allowing us to create a whole new class of interaction and operate in a way that we've not seen before. And these sort of experiments are already going on in places like Montreal. So we're working in Montreal to do some of this stuff. Example, Helsinki, how many of you know Helsinki Restaurant Day? Restaurant Day in Helsinki, few of you? So what was interesting about Restaurant Day when it happened was actually 40,000 people turned up and built their own micro restaurants. And the city council went, what are we going to do? They don't all have street licenses. We're not going to put 40,000 people into prison. So suddenly we are starting to see civic activity which is decentralizing and distributing creativity, yet we don't have the institutional infrastructure to respond and accelerate it. So these sort of regulatory experiments are fundamental to democratize and decentralize those innovations. And I can keep going. But at the end of this story is this bit. This is the most important bit of the talk. Because I think if we're going to start to think about democracy, we have to fundamentally re-understand what it means to be human. And this is where the challenge really starts. Because our conception of being human as an individual, sovereign individual, is perhaps a really convenient illusion for the last 400 to 500 years. The reality is, less than 10% of your physical body is human DNA. The rest of it is massive symbiotic organisms that work with us to actually keep us healthy, right? So the illusion that you're all human, no, not real. How about this, right? We know that your cognitive neuroscience is radically affected by the friends that you keep, right? So we know our cognitive patterns aren't our own, they're social products. They're contagious social products. So you know when your mother said, you are going to be like your friends if you don't behave, that she was right. Now, imagine, so this idea that my brain is my own, that's an illusion. Let's keep going. So we know the effects of poverty transmit 2 generations through epigenetics through the line, right? So what does justice look like if the effects of poverty go 2 generations down the line? We know, in terms of poverty, the impact of poverty means that IQ is suppressed by up to 13 points. So what's a fair test? What is a just test or an exam, right? We know in terms of nutrition absorption, a stressed household, even if you give the same nutritions to 2 children, right? Same nutrition. One household is stressed, the other household is not. The child from a stressed household will not absorb the nutrition, right? We know even in terms of empathetic intelligence, all of this stuff is massively, we understand this stuff. Empathetic intelligence is massively scarred and able to be scarred at a very young age. So when we start to know this stuff, and we know the 21st century is going to be about agile intelligence, empathetic intelligence, these other care components are going to be foundational, how do we create the conditions for this reality? Now let's take this one step further as well. So there's a brilliant piece of work that's been done by Dr. David R. Williams in Harvard, who looked at effectively black Americans and why two black Americans equally educated were dying 10 years in advance of their peers. What he found was that the impact of everyday micro-racism meant they had persistent levels of cortisone in their bloodstream. And persistent levels of cortisone means you become more liable and susceptible to heart disease, diabetes, and all the chronic issues. So we know societally that is 10 years. I grant you, if we stepped into Starship Enterprise from my fellow speaker, Captain, and we stepped into Starship Enterprise, I guarantee you, in 50 years, we will look at that as a form of institutional genocide. Because we understand the biology, we understand the issue, and we understand what it's doing. Now, why I say that is, as we start to understand that, those are the human rights of tomorrow, and those are the essential human rights of a new economy where emotional labor and unlocking the full capacity of every individual is really the responsibility and the opportunity of society. Because remember this, every human being you've ever met is more extraordinary than any general artificial intelligence that's ever been created, or is likely to be created for the next 40 years. Now here's the kicker question. Have we unlocked the full capacity of every human being that works with you? Because if we haven't, that's like having IBM Watsons standing around idle. That's what we've got. So the challenge is unlocking, in the 21st century society, how do you unlock the full capacity of being human? And we know the science, we know the issues. And remember, human rights were built for a labor economy, as we've currently got them. What are the human rights of the 21st century that are essential to unlock the full creative capacity of every human? I think that is the challenge. That is the challenge if we're going to drive a world around radical automation, radical inclusive automation. That is, for me, if we want to talk about democracy, the democracy is not only about the democracy of voting, it's a democracy of imagination, expression, care, innovation. Then we can talk about automation and intelligence. We automated in our AI societies, which are radically inclusive. Because if we don't, we will empower the few and disenfranchise the many. And that is why I think places like here are critical. You have a forum here which is looking at reinventing the institutional infrastructure. You have a society which is actually one of the few in the world which is radically not as unequal as other parts of the world. You have a society which has the capacity to make this leap. You have a unique stepping stone point in history to make that leap into what is going to be a 21st century revolution. And it is going to be massively humane and about unlocking the human capacity of everyone. And with that, I'm sure I'm over time. So I'll close on the big challenges that we want. Thank you.
I think that we're setting some expectations now on this audience, right? So you're asking them to use Almedalen and Sweden as a society to unlock that potential, right? Do you have like one quick thing that everyone here can do?
Imagine, the basic thing is imagine every human you meet is absolutely extraordinary. Have that moment to just think how extraordinary human beings actually are and how we fail to unlock everyone's capacity. And that goes at every level. Every employment contract you write, imagine it is not to control them, but to unleash them. Every relationship you make is there to unleash their capacity, not to control their capacity. It's a fundamentally different mindset, which is about decentralizing creativity rather than controlling it into your perception of what the world needs to be like. That, I think, is a fundamental revolution just in that relationship.
Thank you.